Om asato ma sadgamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityorma amritam gamaya. Om shanti shanti shanti. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good morning, everyone. Excuse me. I'm reminded of a Key and Peele sketch. How many of you have seen Key and Peele, the comedy duo? There's a funny one. It's a fictional scenario. Martin Luther King has just delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech. The whole world is thrilled. And then the fiction is that there's a speaker that has to speak after him. And so they invite the speaker after him, and the guy makes a complete fool out of himself. Who can follow Martin Luther King? So I feel like that, because for the past 2 days, we've had the world-famous Swami Sarvapriyanji giving wonderful, breathtaking classes. On Friday, he gave a class on emptiness. Yesterday, he gave a class on fullness. And so sorry to disappoint you if you're expecting him. He's now giving a talk at this very moment in Hollywood. So don't all rush out at once, because by the time you reach Hollywood, the talk will be done. So in any case, I'll do my best here, and I hope we come away, if not enlightened, then a little edified, and with a few practical tips on spiritual practice. And one thing that's nice about this talk, at least, is that it segues pretty well with Sarvapriyanji's 2 talks. You'll find that there are elements of Buddhist emptiness, and there are also some elements of Vedantic fullness in what I have to talk about today. Because the topic is mindfulness, a very popular topic. I'm sure many of you have, or at least some of you have attended mindfulness retreats somewhere in the US. They're very popular. One thing you'll find, though, is that these mindfulness retreats are generally based on Buddhism, on Buddhist traditions, Vipassana, and many other Buddhist traditions. And I think the case I want to make today is that Vedanta should get a piece of the action as well, a piece of the mindfulness action. And that it's a shame that Vedantic mindfulness is not taught more and practiced more. And I think a lot of people, Vedantins, are practicing mindfulness without knowing that they're practicing mindfulness. So I want to talk about Vedantic mindfulness today. And I hope that in the future we're going to find Vedantic mindfulness retreats popping up here and there throughout the country. And so in this talk, I'll first discuss Buddhist mindfulness, just to get our kind of bearings. So I won't talk about it in detail. Many of you already know about Buddhist mindfulness, but I'll want to go through some of the main practices in Buddhist mindfulness, and then explain Vedantic mindfulness, and explain where Vedantic mindfulness overlaps with Buddhist mindfulness, what we can learn as Vedantins from Buddhist mindfulness techniques, but also where Vedantic mindfulness differs in certain crucial respects from Buddhist mindfulness. And from a certain perspective, we can even see these differences as strengths, as advantages, as unique advantages in the path of Vedantic mindfulness that you don't necessarily have in the path of Buddhist mindfulness. And before anybody gets excited, let me just also add, I'm not going to be claiming that Vedantic mindfulness is better than Buddhist mindfulness. That's not the purpose of this. Each one of us has a particular temperament. And some of us lean Vedantic, others lean Buddhist. Some people lean both. Now that's a kind of common practice. There's a new thing called multiple religious belonging, where many people feel like they're equally Christian, equally Buddhist. Some people feel equally Vedantic, equally Vedantin, equally Buddhist. That's also possible. Many permutations, and I don't want to exclude or foreclose any of them. But if your temperament leans Vedantic, then I think you can take advantage of certain unique features of Vedantic mindfulness that you don't get necessarily in the Buddhist versions of mindfulness that are very popular these days. And if we have a little time at the end, I'd like to put our theory into practice by doing a little brief, maybe 5 to 6 minute practice session of Vedantic mindfulness altogether. So that's the plan. So let's start with Buddhist mindfulness. The foundational text of Buddhist mindfulness is what's called the Satipatthana Sutta in Pali. This comes from the Tipitaka, which is the standard Pali scripture containing Buddha's teachings. And this entire Satipatthana Sutta contains his teachings on mindfulness. Satipatthana Sutta. Sutta means sutra, his teachings. The language Pali is derived from Sanskrit. It's a kind of corruption of Sanskrit. Corruption not in a bad way, but it's a linguistic term. And so the word sati, which means mindfulness, comes from the Sanskrit term smriti, which in many other Indian philosophical contexts, in spiritual contexts, means remembrance or recollection. But it has a very special meaning in Buddhism. Sati, mindfulness, it means mindfulness rather than just recollection. Okay, being mindful. And patthana, the Pali word patthana, comes from the Sanskrit term prasthana, which means foundation or pillar. So in this extremely important foundational text on mindfulness, Buddha distinguishes 4 foundations of mindfulness, 4 types of mindfulness practice. And I'm just going to go through them very briefly. They're all very helpful for Vedantins as well. First kind of mindfulness is mindfulness of body. And one can be mindful of whatever's happening, and there are some mindfulness practices where you start at the toes and you work your way up, all the way up to the head. And just be mindful of what's happening at the level of body. But the most important kind of mindfulness at the level of body is mindfulness of breath in the Buddhist practice. I think any of you who are aware of mindfulness techniques will know that mindfulness of breath mindfulness is extremely important in the Buddhist tradition, and for good reason. One thing about the breath is that it's this neutral thing. We don't have strong feelings about our breath, but it's something we do constantly, right? And so all that breath mindfulness does is brings our attention to something that's happening all the time, and which is sort of naturally calming if you do it well, and if you do it regularly as a practice. Second kind of mindfulness, there are many different ways of doing mindfulness practice in Buddhism, and one way is to do it sequentially. You can start with breath mindfulness, body mindfulness, and then work to the other forms, or you can just focus on one for the entire practice. But the first one is mindfulness of body, especially mindfulness of breath, as you inhale, as you exhale. Second kind of mindfulness of feelings. Whatever feelings come up in the mind, however you're feeling, whether pleasant or unpleasant or neutral, just be mindful. And it's extremely important in all forms of mindfulness, whether it's Buddhist or Vedantin. The key is non-judgmental awareness. Be aware, but we have a constant tendency to judge ourselves. Especially in Christian traditions, there's this idea of original sin. So we kind of beat ourselves up and, I'm not worthy, I feel guilty. Drop it. Whatever's happening at the level of body-mind, just be aware of it without judging yourself. Non-judgmental awareness. This is a term that's used, all of this information I'm giving you on Buddhist mindfulness is taken from a really good book, which I recommend. It's called Satipatthana, The Direct Path to Realization, by a very scholarly German Theravada Buddhist monk named Analayo, Analayo. You can get it on Amazon. It's a very good book. It's a very detailed discussion from the standpoint of a scholar practitioner, which is very valuable. He's not just a scholar, but a Buddhist monk who's practicing mindfulness, and explaining in detail this text of the Buddha, Satipatthana Sutta, and explaining how we can put it into practice. And he brings these Buddhist practices into dialogue with contemporary scientific, neuroscientific studies, which is very interesting. I'll get to that a little later. And so with regard to the second kind of mindfulness of feelings, this is what Buddha has to say. He says, these are his direct words from the Satipatthana Sutta. Here, when feeling a pleasant feeling, he knows, I feel a pleasant feeling. When feeling an unpleasant feeling, he knows, I feel an unpleasant feeling. When feeling a neutral feeling, he knows, I feel a neutral feeling. Notice, no judgment here. No freaking out. No fight. I don't want to have an unpleasant feeling. Just be aware of what's happening. And what happens is, through that act of sheer awareness, non-judgmental awareness, you automatically take a step back from whatever you're feeling. And you get some breathing space. And you're not so closely identified with that feeling. Usually the problem comes in when it's an unpleasant feeling, right? Whether it's depression or anxiety or anger or lust, whatever it is. Just by being aware of that non-judgmentally, what happens, we take a step back from that feeling. And we feel this breathing room, this kind of sense of liberation, of freedom from that feeling, from thraldom to that feeling. Third kind of mindfulness. Mindfulness of the thoughts that arise in our mind. This is what Buddha says in the same Satipatthana Sutta about mindfulness of thoughts. And how monks, he's addressing monks, and how monks does he, in regard to the mind, abide contemplating the mind? Here he knows a lustful mind to be lustful, and a mind without lust to be without lust. He knows an angry mind to be angry, and a mind without anger to be without anger. He knows a deluded mind to be deluded, and a mind without delusion to be without delusion. He knows a concentrated mind to be concentrated, and an unconcentrated mind to be unconcentrated. So you get the idea. But again, notice, all you're doing is just recognizing, being non-judgmentally aware of whatever comes up in the mind. And the moment you do that, you're going to feel a little distance from that thought, whatever it is, however unpleasant it might be. Fourth kind of mindfulness. Mindfulness of what Buddha calls the 5 hindrances, pancha nivarana. Otherwise known as dhammas. This is mindfulness of dharmas, but dharma in a very specific sense here, in the sense of the 5 hindrances. What are these 5 hindrances according to Buddhism? Sense desire. Kama chandam is the Pali. So the first is sense desire, any desire for sense pleasures. Aversion. The third is sloth and torpor, so laziness. Restlessness and worry is the fourth hindrance. Hindrance to what? To spiritual progress, spiritual practice. To enlightenment, nirvana. And fifth is doubt. So Buddha has a special category of mindfulness just devoted to these 5 hindrances. And again, the same thing is done, but with a slight nuance here. So let me read directly from the Satipatthana Sutta. This is what Buddha says about this fourth very important kind of mindfulness, mindfulness of the 5 hindrances. Buddha says, if sensual desire is present, he knows there is sensuous desire in me. If sensuous desire is not present in him, he knows there is no sensual desire in me. And he knows how unarisen sensual desire can arise, how arisen sensual desire can be removed, and how a future arising of the removed sensual desire can be prevented. So this is much more subtle in a way, this final practice, because on the one hand, it's the same non-judgmental, non-reactive awareness of whatever hindrances come up in the mind, whether that's lust or aversion or laziness, restlessness, anxiety. But he adds these extra teachings, 3 more teachings. He knows how unarisen sensual desire can arise. So there's a kind of analytical component to this as well. It's what Vedantins call vichara. So this is mindfulness combined with awareness of how that hindrance has arisen in my mind in the first place. What was the cause? Oh, I see. It was that guy who said something mean to me. That's why I'm angry. That's the first thing he adds. Second, how arisen sensual desire can be removed. It's another aspect of vichara, of reasoning, of deeply thinking about the causes of the hindrances and how to remove them. And finally, how a future arising of the removed sensual desire can be prevented. The best technique is preventive this is true of medicine too. Better not to go to the doctor with symptoms, better to prevent the arising of symptoms in the first place. In the same way in spiritual life, if we know how, we should learn from our experiences and learn from our mistakes and all that, right? So we go through an experience, we end up having a hindrance arise in our mind. Let's try to learn from that and ask ourselves, be a kind of like a spiritual detective, and ask ourselves, what was the cause of that hindrance that arose in my mind? And how do I prevent that hindrance from coming up in the future? That's part of this final kind of mindfulness technique. So the way I see it is, Buddha here is encouraging us to combine non-judgmental awareness with a certain kind of analysis, a deep spiritual analysis of the etiology, that's the medical term, means the cause of whatever hindrances arise in our spiritual life. And as I mentioned, this wonderful book on the Satipatthana Sutta by Bhikkhu Analayo also refers to scientific studies relating to mindfulness. He refers specifically to a 1975 study, so it's quite dated, but still really interesting. And there are many more recent studies confirming the results of this study. But this was a really pioneering study done in 1975. The case concerned a young male, 23-year-old male, who had severe alcoholism problems and extreme aggression. He was violent. And he was put in a rehab clinic. And without telling him that they're going to teach him a Buddhist mindfulness technique, they just said this: whenever a thought of aggression or a thought or a desire to drink alcohol arises in your mind, just label it. Name it. Just say, a thought, a desire to drink has arisen in my mind, or I feel like hurting somebody. Within 8 weeks, he was cured. Just through this technique, without even knowing that this is a Buddhist technique. And so, the point is not that everybody will be cured magically, but it's effective in many cases. And more recently, as I said, so in 2018, there was a meta-study of 37 studies on mindfulness with over 3,000 participants, and they looked at mindfulness-based approaches to substance abuse. And they found that in many cases that they're very successful, that it helps a lot. So these are very concrete and very, very helpful techniques, what I've been talking about, this Buddhist mindfulness. And one of the nice things about Vedantic mindfulness, as I understand it, as we're about to discuss, is that it helps itself to all of these benefits of Buddhist mindfulness and then adds a couple new dimensions. So let's get into it. Vedantic mindfulness. I'm going to be basing, even the term, you might not even have heard the term Vedantic mindfulness before. I'm not aware of any book or article on this. I sort of came up with it. I don't want to claim that I'm the founder of it. It's been there. All these treasures are there in our Vedantic scriptures, but as far as I'm aware, nobody has kind of pulled out these treasures and called it, this is Vedantic mindfulness. So that's what I kind of want to do. And my main text is going to be the Bhagavad Gita. It's a wonderful thing about the Gita. There are many wonderful things about it, but one thing that I really like about it, which it has in common with another one of my two. So I have two favorite texts, two desert island spiritual books. One is the Bhagavad Gita. The other one, you're going to say I'm biased because I'm a monk of the Ramakrishna order, but it's the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, but in the original Bengali. And these two books have something in common. You're going to find in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna two kinds of teaching, at least, but two main kinds of teaching. One is very lofty spiritual and philosophical teachings on every page. And the second kind of teaching you find throughout the Gospel are teachings on spiritual practice, extremely practical teachings about the need to engage in prayer and reasoning between the real and the unreal, the permanent and the impermanent. So you get a combination of the highest philosophy and spirituality on the one hand, and kind of very practical tips for spiritual practice on the other. And I think the same thing can be said of the Bhagavad Gita. In fact, at the end of every chapter of the Gita, when you recite it in Sanskrit, this is the tradition, that they've added what's called a colophon. And every chapter is described as Brahma Vidyayam Yoga Shastre, which means this Bhagavad Gita teaches the science of Brahman, Brahma Vidya, the knowledge of Brahman. So these are the highest spiritual and philosophical teachings about ultimate reality. And it's also equally a yoga shastra. Yoga shastra means it's a practical spiritual manual. And so the Gita explains very nicely how to practice Vedantic mindfulness, or so I want to argue today. And we can just put it directly into practice, as I hope you'll see. So, Vedantic mindfulness is based on the idea that all our suffering stems from not realizing who we truly are. We suffer from an identity crisis. We think we're the body, so whenever the body's in pain, we're in pain. We think we're the mind, so anytime the mind experiences suffering or bad thoughts, we feel bad, we feel depressed, we feel anxious, we feel angry. What Vedanta tells us, what the Bhagavad Gita tells us, is that you are not the body. You are also not the mind. Each one of us is an eternal, divine self. Atman is the Sanskrit term. Separate from the body-mind complex. Ever pure, ever perfect, ever free. One with God. And just knowing that is so empowering. Knowing that we're not this little I, but that we're this great spiritual I. Chandogya Upanishad says, Yo vai bhuma tat sukham nalpe sukham asti. There is no happiness in the small, in the finite. There is only bliss in the infinite. Each one of us is that infinite self, and we don't know it, and so we suffer because of it. So the premise, the foundation of Vedantic mindfulness is, you are not the body-mind complex. You are the eternal divine self, ever perfect, ever free, ever pure. So now, there's one technical question which I just want to kind of broach, but not go into in much detail. I've been using the term Vedantic mindfulness, but some of you might know that Vedanta is a vast philosophical tradition with many schools within it, only one of which is Advaita Vedanta. And there are other schools of Vedanta. There's Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, qualified non-dualism. There's Dvaita Vedanta, dualistic Vedanta, and there are many others. Achinta Bheda Veda, Shuddhadvaita. Which one am I talking about? I'm talking about all of them. Not in detail, but the way I'm explaining Vedantic mindfulness applies across the board to all of the different Vedantic schools. You might say, well, how can that be? They're so different. It's true. But every single school of Vedanta without exception, and a lot of people don't know this, they think this is that the non-dual school of Vedanta has a monopoly on what I've just been talking about, that we're not the body-mind complex, but we're the eternal divine self. No, every school of Vedanta, every bhakti school of Vedanta, meaning every school that teaches devotion toward a personal God, teaches exactly the same thing. You are not the body-mind complex. You are an eternal divine soul. But there is a difference between the non-dual understanding of the self and other schools of Vedanta. But from the standpoint of mindfulness, it's a very, very minor, I would say almost simple selves. You don't have one self, and you don't have a different self. I don't have a different self. There's one self. The self is non-dual pure consciousness, according to Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta. Other schools of Vedanta, so for instance Ramanuja, they'll say, yes, we agree with you, Shankara, that each one of us suffers because we mistakenly identify with the body-mind complex. And in reality, each one of us is an eternal divine soul, which Ramanuja says is one with God, part of God. But, Ramanuja says, I disagree with you, Shankara, that there's only one self. I have an individual self separate from you, and each one of us has a separate individual self. But why is that not important from the standpoint of mindfulness? Because the point is, the moment we realize that we're an eternal self separate from the body-mind complex, we're free from suffering. According to Ramanuja, he says, this is also very interesting, he says, to really feel love for God, genuine devotion, bhakti for God, you have to first realize yourself as an eternal individual soul separate from the body-mind complex. This is really and very practical too. Many of us talk about God, but we don't really, that feeling for God doesn't come from within. The reason is because we're identifying with the body-mind complex. So even Ramanuja, we're not talking about Shankara here. Ramanuja says a precondition for feeling genuine devotion for God is breaking our identification with the body-mind complex and realizing that we're an eternal soul, an eternal self, the Jivatma, separate from the body-mind complex. Only then can we feel true inner feeling, inner devotion for God. Okay, that was a bit of a detour, but now coming back. So what is Vedantic mindfulness according to the Bhagavad Gita? There are two terms in Sanskrit that are very important in the Gita in order to understand this mindfulness technique. Number one is prakriti. Prakriti means nature. And it's composed of 3 gunas. That's the second key term that's necessary to understand Vedantic mindfulness. Gunas is a term that has been translated in many different ways, none of which are, I think, totally satisfactory. So some people choose to just leave it untranslated. One of the standard translations is qualities. I don't think that quite captures the connotations of the term gunas. I prefer the term energies, even though that's not perfect either. But let's stick with that for now. There are 3 basic gunas, energies, according to Vedanta. Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. And depending on which of these 3 gunas preponderates in us, we're going to feel a certain way. If sattva, the sattva guna, the sattvika energy preponderates, we feel calm, we feel tranquil, we feel sort of naturally detached from all the temptations and attachments that face ordinary human beings. Rajas, if Rajas preponderates in us, the Rajasika energy, we're going to feel restless, we're going to feel like sort of, I have to do this, and then I have to do that, and then I have to do that. You don't, like, if you sit a very Rajasic person down and say, just sit still for 5 minutes, they're going to freak out. They can't. They're full of so much nervous energy that they can't just sit still. So they have to keep themselves busy. That's a sign of Rajas, having tremendous Rajas. And being very ambitious, that's a sign of Rajas. Being full of desires, very Rajasic. These are all signs of Rajas. And Tamas, the third kind of energy. Tamas literally means darkness. And for good reason. This is when tamas preponderates in us, how do we feel? Lazy, sleepy, always procrastinating, putting things off to the last minute, not even kind of wanting to get up out of bed in the morning. Depression is highly tamasic. Anxiety might be more like rajasic. So you can actually even classify different psychological conditions based on these 3 gunas. The 3 gunas paradigm is incredibly helpful in understanding, in making progress in spiritual life, in understanding where we currently stand, and in understanding what concrete steps we can take to make spiritual progress. I've given a separate lecture on this. You can look it up on YouTube if you're interested, on the 3 gunas in spiritual life. So I don't want to go into the details now, but only for understanding mindfulness. So let's now fast forward to chapter 14 of the Bhagavad Gita. Chapter 14 is all about the 3 energies, the 3 gunas. Krishna explains in great detail the workings of these 3 gunas and how these different energies manifest in us as spiritual aspirants on a day-to-day basis. And then, in verse 19 of chapter 14 of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna starts to explain the technique of Vedantic mindfulness. This is the original Sanskrit verse, and then I'll give the translation. Nanyam gunebhyaha kartaram yada drashtanupashyati gunebhyascha param veti madbhavam sodigachyati. When the seer, the drashta, notice the term drashta, witness, seer. When the seer perceives that the gunas, the energies, sattva, rajas, tamas, are doing everything, and knows that which is supreme beyond the gunas, that person attains my divine nature. This is Krishna speaking, so Krishna is God. So what is he saying here? Instead of identifying ourselves with whatever is happening at the level of body, even at the level of the body, even at the level of mind, whatever thoughts arise in the mind, whatever feelings come up, whatever is happening, all of that belongs to Prakriti, to the 3 gunas. And the play of the gunas is going on continually. Sometimes we'll feel more sattvic, other times we'll feel more rajasic, other times we'll feel very tamasic. What does Krishna say? Instead of freaking out or saying, I'm not sattvic enough, I have to become more sattvic, and beating yourself up about it, take a step back from the workings of these 3 gunas, from the play of the gunas. Identify with the drashta, the seer, capital S. Seer, the witness. Be the detached witness of what's happening at the level of body-mind. That's the practice of Vedantic mindfulness. And in verses 22 to 23, he explains this in a little bit more detail. He says, Sanskrit again, then I'll explain. Prakasham cha pravrittim cha moham eva cha pandava na dveshti sampravrittani na nivrittani kankshati. The gunatita, the person who has transcended the three energies, the three gunas, the realized soul, the illumined being, is the person who is not affected by whatever arises in the mind. That person is not troubled when the mind is turbulent or deluded. And even when the mind is not in a state of sattvic illumination, that person doesn't long for such a state. This might be startling to some of you. You might be thinking, if the person is really realized, why should that person even have bad thoughts at all come up? This might be one way of thinking. But no, Krishna says in the Gita, even the illumined soul, at the level of mind and at the level of body, I mean, Sri Ramakrishna had a fatal case of throat cancer, and he passed away from it, right? And Jivan Muktas, they can have all sorts of thoughts come up in the mind. What's the difference between the way an illumined soul handles or kind of behaves toward whatever's happening at the level of body-mind and the ordinary unillumined soul? The difference is not what comes up in the mind, but how you look upon, how you handle those thoughts, how you handle those feelings, how you handle those bodily pains. The unillumined soul will immediately identify with the bodily pain and say, I'm in terrible pain, my life is miserable, and you start feeling sorry for yourself. The unillumined soul will identify immediately with the depression or the anxiety or whatever feelings come up in the mind and say, I feel depressed and I'm in a rut. And same thing at the level of thought. Immediately identify with what's happening at the body-mind level. The illumined soul is the least bothered by what's happening at the level of body-mind. Just because of what's called prarabdha karma, which is that person's past karma. Some thoughts may arise in the mind. The illumined soul is completely unaffected by them. He enjoys it, he or she, just watching the play of the gunas unfold before him or her. And Krishna goes on to explain in the next verse the same idea. Udasina vadasino gunaid yo na vichalyate guna vattantityeva yo vatishtati nengate. The gunatita, that same person, that illumined soul who has transcended the three energies, that person who stands far beyond the gunas, who sees that whatever is happening at the level of body and mind is nothing but the workings of Prakriti, of the three gunas, the three energies. That person stands apart, tranquil and unaffected. This is the practice of Vedantic mindfulness. Now notice, on the one hand, there are deep similarities with Buddhist mindfulness, as I explained in the beginning of this talk. Because Krishna will fully agree with Buddha. Yes, you should be non-judgmentally aware of what's happening at the level of the body-mind, at the level of the body, at the level of feeling, at the level of mind. We agree completely. Krishna will just add another wrinkle to the practice, which I think is very fruitful for Vedantins, which is, it gives us a kind of metaphysical anchor for our mindfulness practice. Because when we break our identification with the body-mind complex, when we take a step back from it, we identify with our own deeper self. And Buddhists, as I'm going to point out in a second, can't say that. They don't want to say it. I don't want to say they can't say it. They don't want to say that we have a deeper self, which we truly are, from the standpoint of which we can witness what's happening at the body-mind. That's a very Vedantic idea. Buddhists don't agree with that in general. There are many schools of Buddhism, and I don't want to, because Sarvapriyaji went into that, went into some of the details on Friday, so I'm not going to go into the details now. But in any case, before I get there, into some of the differences between Buddhist mindfulness and Vedantic mindfulness, I just wanted to mention very briefly that in the remainder of that same chapter 14 of the Gita, Krishna then explains what are the fruits, what are the benefits of mindfulness practice. And there are these wonderful terms he uses in Sanskrit to explain the state of being of the illumined soul who has practiced Vedantic mindfulness and achieved illumination through that practice. He says that person is sama dukkha sukha, which means equal in the midst of terrible sorrow and in the midst of happiness. And you might say, how can an illumined being even feel sorrow? What does that mean? Sorrow or happiness at the level of mind. Which again, let it come up. And the illumined soul is completely unbothered. Because the illumined soul doesn't identify with the mind. You see, there might be happiness or unhappiness at the level of mind. The illumined soul doesn't identify with either happiness or unhappiness. Because he knows he's beyond both. He's the eternal divine self. What is happiness to the self? Another epithet used to describe the benefits of this Vedantic mindfulness practice. Tulya priya priyo. Tulya priya priyaha. Priya means what's dear to us, what we love. Apriya is the opposite, what we hate. The illumined soul, the one who's transcended the three energies by means of this Vedantic mindfulness practice, are tulya priya priyo. Completely indifferent. It's the same to me. Whether I get my favorite tiramisu or whatever, or I get the food that I hate, which in my case, well, no, I won't even. Anyway, we all have our foods we hate. No, but the illumined soul won't have these strong likes and dislikes, completely unaffected by either. Because if I say what I hate and it ends up being it for lunch, I'm going to get in trouble with the Matajis here. So, and another attribute of the illumined soul who has transcended the three gunas by means of mindfulness practice. Tulyanindatma stuti, tulyanindatma samstutihi, tulyanindatma samstutihi. Ninda in Sanskrit means insult, criticism. I get a lot of it. I get a lot of both actually. And so I'm used to you have to practice. It's useful to actually learn how to be equal to both praise and criticism. And the illumined soul, for the illumined soul, it's not a practice, it's spontaneous. Who cares if somebody calls you a name or criticizes you? But equally, who cares if somebody praises you? Now, that doesn't mean you should be indifferent. The idea is, this is how I see it at least. If somebody criticizes something you're doing, you should first ask yourself, is it valid? Ask yourself that calmly, instead of getting emotional and reacting. Is there some truth to the criticism? If there's truth to it, try to learn from the criticism. And if you can, then you should be grateful to the person who pointed that out, that mistake out to you or that weakness out to you. On the other hand, if the criticism is baseless, then why should you even worry about it at all? You can just, it's water off a duck's back. Not bothered. In either case, the right reaction is not emotionally getting defensive, justifying yourself, how dare that person. No, either you learn from it and you should be grateful to the person criticizing you, or you should be completely indifferent because you know that it's baseless. Right? This is also a kind of Vedantic mindfulness technique. What comes spontaneously to the illumined soul is a practice for the rest of us. This is something that Shankara says beautifully in his commentary on chapter 2 of the Bhagavad Gita, because there's a string of attributes referring to the illumined soul in chapter 2. And then Shankara says, well, what about us who are not illumined? How is that helpful to us? It's great to know that there are Buddhas and Jesuses Sri Ram Krishnas who are perfect souls, but where does that leave us? What comes spontaneously to the illumined soul is a practice for the rest of us, spiritual aspirants. We should try to cultivate these same qualities that are natural to the illumined soul actively in our spiritual lives on a day-to-day basis. That's the idea. And another thing I wanted to bring your attention to in the Bhagavad Gita, I think it's really interesting. So I just mentioned chapter 2, so it's a nice segue actually. One of the keynotes of the Bhagavad Gita is the need to renounce desire. Desire, kama. This is a term that comes up again and again. All kinds of sense desires. Remember, Buddha is saying the same thing. But in the span of just a few verses, Krishna distinguishes two distinct approaches to handling sense desires when they arise in the mind. They're very different. Okay. The first one is described in the 70th verse of chapter 2. Chapter 2 is a long chapter. This is 70, the 70th verse. It's a beautiful verse, one of my favorites. Oh no, sorry, before I get there. That's the mindfulness one. Before I get to the mind. So the first technique is not mindfulness, but it can be effective in certain circumstances. This is verse 55 of chapter 2. Prajahati yada kaman sarvan pathamanogatan. That's the beginning of this verse. This whole text, by the way, the scripture, as many of you know, is supposed to take place on a battlefield. Arjuna is a great warrior. He's supposed to fight in a just war. In a just war, remember. So it means he's on the right side of the war. But he doesn't want to. And Krishna is trying to persuade him to fight in this war. So this theme of battle is very prominent throughout the Bhagavad Gita. And it's used in a literal sense because there's an actual war that's supposed to be waged. At the same time, Krishna repeatedly uses martial metaphors to describe spiritual techniques and spiritual practices. Okay? And this is one of those cases. Prajahati yada kaman. Prajahati means slay. When you slay all desires that arise in the mind, then you are an illumined being. Literally slaying, murdering, killing those desires that arise in your mind. This is not mindfulness. But it can be effective in certain circumstances. Even Buddha, there's another sutta in the Tipitaka where he describes, I think it was 5 different ways of handling hindrances that arise in the mind. And one of them is mindfulness, but there are others. The thing is, we need the more techniques we have at our disposal, the more likely it is that in any given situation, we can apply the technique that works for us. Because our minds, as Vedanta says, our minds are not always in the same kind of state. The gunas, the 3 energies, are always in a state of flux. So depending on what our current state of being is, we can use the technique that best helps us in that moment. So it's good to expose ourselves to different techniques. So I'm not saying that one technique is worse than the other. These are used in different circumstances, depending on your state of mind and preference and temperament. So this first technique it's this kind of head-on approach, the frontal attack on whatever desires arise in the mind. You're like a kind of warrior, and if it comes up, like in a video game almost, Mortal Kombat with your desires. Sometimes that backfires. The danger of this is by treating whatever sense desires, attachments that come up in the mind as your enemy, which is a term that's used in the Gita again and again, Vaidinam. No lust to be your enemy, no anger to be your enemy. The problem is you might be giving those emotions, those feelings, those thoughts more power over you than they deserve. You turn everything into this kind of huge World War, III between me and my desires. So Krishna teaches another technique, which is Vedantic mindfulness, which encourages you to adopt a very different attitude toward the same kinds of hindrances, the same kinds of desires, but it's very different. What is it? It's described in verse 70. As I said, one of my favorite verses. It's very beautiful and poetic. Apuryamanam achala pratishtham samudramapaf pravishanti yadvat tadvat kama yam pravishanti sarve sashantim apnoti nakamakami. It's very beautiful poetry. That person attains peace, into whom all desires, the same word kama, into whom all desires enter as streams into a sea, as small streams into a vast sea, that is ever being filled, yet ever motionless and unaffected. Not the person who is disturbed by every little inrush of desire. So see, just within a few verses, Krishna is describing 2 very different techniques for tackling sense desires and any kind of hindrances in spiritual life. One is the frontal attack approach. It comes up and you slay it. The second one is Vedantic mindfulness. And it's this very evocative metaphor. Imagine that you are a vast, infinite sea. And imagine that these desires coming into your mind are like these tiny little streams coming into that sea. Is the sea affected by these small streams? No, absolutely not. Completely unaffected. In the same way, don't be bothered. Whatever comes up in the mind, just take a step back from them. Let them come. Just don't identify with them. Let them come knowing that they're gonna that state, that feeling, that thought is going to pass away, inevitably, because that's the nature of nature, the nature of Prakriti, the nature of the 3 energies, the 3 gunas. A thought arises, it remains for a moment, and then it passes away. When the body is unhealthy, when the body is sick, we should tell ourselves, I am the immortal Atman, completely separate from the body. ever pure, ever free. When feelings of depression or unhappiness or anxiety or lust or anger come up, we should tell ourselves, I am the ever blissful, ever pure Atman, completely unaffected by depression or anxiety or lust or anger. This is a technique which Swami Vivekananda teaches again and again. Again, this is what Vedantins don't usually use the term mindfulness, and I think that's a shame, because if they did, then I think that the term mindfulness has so many helpful and beneficial contemporary resonances that if we just use that label, I think that people will feel that Vedantic practice is much more meaningful in their spiritual lives. So Swamiji, I see this as a Vedantic mindfulness technique. He says, repeat to yourself, I am the infinite blue sky. Over me pass these clouds of various colors. Remain a moment and vanish. I am the same eternal blue. I am the witness, the same eternal witness of all. Isn't this Vedantic mindfulness? Isn't this what Bhagavad Gita is teaching us in chapter 14? Isn't this also very similar to what Buddha taught? Except for that wrinkle, which is, Buddha's not going to say, I'm the infinite blue sky. But that's what Vedanta says. You can identify with your deeper spiritual nature. I am the infinite blue sky. The Krishna's metaphor in verse 70 of chapter 2. I am that infinite vast ocean into which these little streams of desire come. Why should I be bothered by them? In Raja Yoga, another wonderful text of Swamiji's, Swami Vivekananda's, in fact, he suggests that we practice mindfulness. He says this is a very useful practice at the very beginning, before we do our main meditation practice. So let me read you directly from Raja Yoga. He says, the first is like that monkey jumping about. Let the monkey jump as much as he can. You simply wait and watch. Knowledge is power, says the proverb, and that is true. Until you know what the mind is doing, you cannot control it. Give it the rein. Give it the rein. Many hideous thoughts may come into it. You will be astonished that it was possible for you to think such thoughts. But you will find that each day the mind's vagaries are becoming less and less violent. That each day it is becoming calmer. So this is a beautiful description of Vedantic mindfulness at the very beginning of your practice. Instead of feeling bad about the fact that your mind is distracted or full of worldly thoughts, just let the mind run on at the very beginning of the practice. And just have fun watching what comes up in the mind. And have fun is important. Don't take yourself so seriously. I think part of the problem in spiritual life is we take ourselves too seriously. And then we get depressed if we don't make enough spiritual progress. There's one monk who complained to Holy Mother and said, I've been doing so much japa and meditation and I'm not making any spiritual progress. She says, is spiritual life something like where you think that you've done so much and so you expect this in return? Is it shopkeeping with God? I've done so many hours of spiritual practice, therefore you owe me liberation? No, that's not the way these things work. And don't freak out so much about, progress. That can itself become another kind of mania. Obsessing about how much progress I'm making, looking at your neighbor, your fellow, whoever. If you're in a monastery, you might look at your brother and might say, boy, that person could really sit for way longer than I can for meditation. These are all unhealthy in spiritual life. Focus on your own practice and chill out a little. Mindfulness helps us to chill out. Okay, so I've already mentioned this a couple times, but I want to emphasize now. So what are some of the key differences between Vedantic mindfulness practice on the one hand and Buddhist mindfulness on the other? Number one, Buddhism is famous for their anatta doctrine. Pali, anatta comes from anatma in Sanskrit, which means no self or non-self. There is no deepest underlying self, according to most schools of Buddhism. So in the Buddhist technique of mindfulness, Buddhists don't tell you to identify with your true nature as some eternal self, but Vedanta does. And as I said, for a certain kind of temperament, for people who lean Vedantic, that can be tremendously helpful. Because as I said, then mindfulness practice has a metaphysical basis, a metaphysical anchor. You can identify with your own deeper spiritual nature from the vantage point of which you can just observe as a detached witness what's happening at the level of body-mind. You can say, it's literally not me. Those thoughts, those unpleasant thoughts that come up in my mind, they're not me. Those feelings that arise in my heart, they're not me, they're not mine. The pains that come up in my body, they're not mine because I'm not the body. I am the eternal self, ever pure, ever free. The second advantage of Vedantic mindfulness over Buddhist mindfulness, for those who lean toward Vedanta, is that there's absolutely no incompatibility between mindfulness and devotion. And how many of you have attended some kind of mindfulness retreat in the past? A few, yeah. And if it's Buddhist, I can almost guarantee you they're not going to be talking about God much or devotion. And I've talked to some friends who have attended mindfulness retreats, and they say that they're very, I don't want to say rigid here, because I don't want to come off as criticizing it. But the idea is, it's a very specific practice, and they don't encourage you to kind of dabble in other practices at the same time. But Vedantic mindfulness is nice, because Vedanta is very broad. And Vedanta will say, practice mindfulness to your heart's content, but never think that mindfulness is incompatible with the other yogas. So in Vedanta, there are 4 basic yogas. Mindfulness itself, it's difficult to categorize, but I think it falls under, it's got one leg in each of 2 yogas, I think. Jnana yoga, the yoga of knowledge, because there's a kind of intellectual dimension to it. You're taking a step back from your body-mind complex. But it's also, it has one foot in the Raja Yoga camp, the yoga of concentration, of meditation, because it's a kind of meditation. You're focusing on, you're being mindful of what's happening at the level of the body-mind. So if mindfulness falls under Jnana Yoga / Raja Yoga, there are 2 other yogas, at least, 2 other main yogas. Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of devotion toward a personal God, and Karma Yoga, the yoga of selfless works, selfless action, engaging in the world, doing whatever you're doing, whether it's your 9-to-5 job or raising kids, but doing it selflessly by trying to take the ego out of it. And what Vedanta tells you is, practice mindfulness to your heart's content, but you can equally practice bhakti yoga at the same time. And in fact, it can actually help, it can enhance, it can strengthen your mindfulness practice. How? In Buddhism, one sometimes feels that you're on your own. You might have a guru to help you or some senior monks. That's nice. But there's no higher power there to help you in your practice. Whereas in Vedanta, even when you're messing up your mindfulness, you can if you try to engage in mindfulness practice, you're going to see how difficult it is. It sounds nice, but then when you shut your eyes and you try to focus on your breath, within 2 seconds it's going to get diverted to something, what you ate for breakfast or what you're going to eat for lunch. So it's difficult. Mindfulness practice is difficult, like all spiritual practices. And one advantage of Vedanta is that you can always fall back on God and pray to God and say, oh God, I'm not able to do this mindfulness practice well. Give me the strength, give me the power to do it better. So you can combine bhakti with mindfulness, devotion with mindfulness. That's another advantage, I would say. And finally, so these are the 2 main, there are 2 unique features of Vedantic mindfulness that I want to emphasize, and then we can end with a brief practice. First is, there's a kind of metaphysical foundation for mindfulness in Vedanta. What's that foundation? The fact that in our deepest nature, we are that eternally pure, ever free, eternally divine self, right? And second, we can combine our mindfulness practice with all the other spiritual practices that we're doing without feeling any compunction about it. Without feeling that if we do this, then it's going to, we have to stop doing that. No. Vedanta is, I call it the both and paradigm rather than the either or paradigm. It's not either I practice mindfulness or I'm a devotee or I'm a karma yogi. Why not everything at once? And you might think, well, and then you become a dilettante, you don't do anything deeply. No, take one as your main practice, whatever that might be. What Vedanta says is, first analyze yourself. If you're fundamentally devotional in nature, make bhakti yoga your main practice and make the other 3 yogas kind of satellites around it. And if you find that you're full of a certain kind of rajas, your aim should be to make it a kind of sattvika rajas by practicing karma yoga. Your main practice will then be karma yoga. And the other 3 yogas will be kind of satellites around it. And so on and so forth. But there's no one-size-fits-all formula in Vedanta. First step is, who am I? Analyze yourself. What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? And then you can custom design a spiritual practice that's uniquely suited to your nature. In fact, Swami Vivekananda, he would sometimes make these wonderful statements. One of these is, he says, no person is born into a religion. Each person has an individualized religion in the depths of his or her soul. Every single one of us in this room has a different religion in the depths of your soul. That's the beauty of Vedanta. The first step is discover what that unique religion, that custom-made religion just for you is, and then you can practice it to your heart's content. All right, so let's do a brief practice and we'll end. Vedantic mindfulness. Gently close your eyes. Focus on the heart center. And imagine an effulgent light in the heart. That effulgent light is your own eternal, ever pure, ever free self. Now let's meditate on that effulgent light of self in our heart. Breathe normally. Repeat to yourself mentally, I am this effulgent light in my heart, the eternally pure, eternally free self, separate from the body-mind complex. I am completely unaffected by what happens to my body. I am completely unaffected by what happens at the level of mind. Now draw your attention to your breath. And if you want a point of reference, you can sort of concentrate on the tip of your nose, where the breath goes in and out. Just be mindful of your inhalation and mindful as you exhale. Anytime you feel your mind, you see your mind wandering away from the breath, gently bring it back to the breath. Now bring your attention to whatever feelings that you're feeling, whether pleasant or unpleasant. And just be mindful of those feelings. Without identifying with those feelings. Take a step back from them and just observe them, non-judgmentally. Now draw your attention to the thoughts that arise in your mind. Let the thoughts come and go. Don't be identified with them. Just take a step back from them. Watch them non-judgmentally, whatever they are, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. Now bring your attention back to your breath. Be mindful of the inhalation. And be mindful as you exhale. Concentrating on the tip of your nose as the breath comes in and goes out. And as you exhale, imagine that all the negative thoughts and feelings are being exhaled out of the nose. Now, finally bring your attention back to the heart center, that effulgent light of the self. And always try to keep in mind, not just now, but throughout the day, that in our deepest essence, we are that eternally pure, ever free, divine self. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.
Thoughts run here and then go there to remember joys and sorrows lived and shared. So many waves of thought and care as I journey from here to there. Then I find myself on a mountain high with light so pure and a big blue sky. And my spirit reaches out to fly as I hear the eagle cry. Then I soar beyond life's ocean's waves to a blissful sea and a crystal cave, to that silent peace of a mountain's heart, to that same place in my heart. Silence deep within this sacred place, this precious gem, my mind and heart fly to release, and I feel the sweetest peace, the sweetest peace.
Some announcements. I'll be holding a question and answer if any of you are interested in a few minutes here. You can come if you have any questions about what I just said. Next Sunday at 11 o'clock here in the Santa Barbara Temple is a lecture by Swami Sarvadeva called Fear Not, O Learned One. And I'll be greeting you outside right now, I guess. Thank you. Have a wonderful Sunday. All right, so questions. People are slowly trickling in. Yeah, in the meantime, please tell me your name and then ask the question.
My name is Ron.
Hi, Ron.
So the question is there a soul or is there not a soul? And my ego says it wants one. And therefore, I have to doubt that.
Right.
Because it's more comfortable having one, so it knows after that it has karma to deal with, and rebirth, and all this stuff.
Right.
And yet, the thing that it fears most is death, and that's the very thing that we want to, we want for it. So in Buddhism,
can you put the mic closer to your mouth? Yeah,
in
thanks.
Buddhism, how does that work? Is it still karmically that you're born, or is it just that you come in this lifetime and you splash and you go out?
Oh, no. Yeah, okay, so you're saying a few things here. The first thing is what you said. The first part of what you said is very Buddhistic, actually. It's a kind of like, well, the ego is deeply invested in believing in some kind of eternal self so that it continues. But one point of clarification is necessary here. That's not Vedanta, because Vedanta doesn't say that we're an eternal ego. It's not the ego that lives forever. But it gets a little bit more complicated, because Vedanta also believes in karma and rebirth, but that the goal of spiritual life is being liberated from rebirth. That's what liberation is, liberation from rebirth, right? And so it distinguishes two levels of self, three levels of self. One is ego in the body. It's an embodied ego. That's what we are now. The body's going to perish at some point in the future. What continues? Two things continue. And this is important. One is what's called the sukshma sharira, the subtle body. That is a repository of our samskaras, latent mental impressions that we've accrued through many lifetimes. You can call it our character. That continues, that persists. And so we're going to be born again with those same latent mental tendencies, those samskaras, in a different body, in our next birth, and so on and so forth. But that's not the eternal self that we've been talking about in the talk today. We have a deeper, eternal, spiritual self. Because the subtle body is still material, it's still physical. It's just a subtle form of matter. But what I'm talking about, what Vedanta says, that in our deepest nature, we are not matter at all. We're not even that subtle body. We're an eternal divine self, which is ever pure and ever free, completely different. It's the diametrical opposite of the ego. And the ego is terrified of that deeper self, because it's a negation of ego. You have to kill ego in order to realize your true identity as that self. So that's regarding the first part of what you said. Remind me of the very end of what you said.
It's more of a question about, in Buddhism, how do they look at extending further than life?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Oh, yeah, right. Thank you. So in Buddhism, they say that they also fully accept karma and rebirth, except with the caveat that there's no enduring self that is reborn again and again across bodies. And so instead, they use these analogies, like it's like you have like 3 candles, and the first candle is lit. How do you light the second candle? You use the first candle, light the second candle, and then but you don't say that it's the same flame across embodiments. So it's a metaphor. They use a lot of metaphors. It gets extremely technical, these debates. And so Hindu schools debate with the Buddhists about this and say that you can't have it both ways. If you accept rebirth, you have to accept some kind of enduring self, because the very idea of rebirth means that it's the same entity that's being reborn. And then they're going to shoot back and say that, no, that's not necessary for these reasons. We Buddhists say we believe in call it a stream of consciousness or something. And it's like an ever-flowing river. And from one birth to the next, it's still, you're not the same person that you were from one birth to another, and yet there's no enduring underlying self. So your question is very good, but it gets very technical very quickly.
That's the way you answered it. It's good.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, first her, and then we can come to... What's your name?
Ankita.
Ankita, right.
Yeah, so thank you for the talk.
Thank you.
I have 2 questions.
Mm-hmm.
So the first is, how do I distinguish between a desire and a necessity? Because I might have like a desire which I don't really need, and my mind might be tricking me to tell, okay, you need this.
Yeah.
And my second question is, if I create a distance from my thoughts,
Mm-hmm.
then how do I get the motivation to do the things which I need to do? Because in my personal experience, I felt that to do something, I have to give importance to that thought.
Right.
Say, apply for a job or
Right.
study. So
Yeah, no, these are great questions. Okay. But I just forgot the first one again. So the first question, remind me?
First was, how do I distinguish between a desire
Oh,
and
yeah.
a necessity?
Okay, yeah. How do you distinguish between want and need, right? I mean, wants and needs, yeah. So we know what the needs are. Food is a need, because if we don't eat, we're going to die, right? Now, the thing is, one thing that contemporary consumer society is extremely adept at is turning needs into excessive wants. We all need to eat food, but what kind of food and how much variety of food and how expensive food, and so there are all these crazes for certain kinds of food and this and that, and then there's also this kind of greed for food. I can't do without X, Y, or Z food. That becomes a desire. That's not a need. You don't need, high-end $200 wines. You don't need to eat at five-star restaurants, right? But you need food. And I'm not saying that you should eat, TV dinners. There's a middle ground to be had here. And you also have to ask yourself where you stand. And each person is different. That's the beauty of Vedanta. And so you have to ask yourself, and this is true of, I'm in a monastic order, and each monk, they come in with a different set of tendencies based on what they've done in the past, in previous births. And some people will have a strong attachment to food, and especially to certain kinds of food. For them, that's a big hindrance in spiritual life. And so then they need to focus a little, they have to be more careful, more vigilant about not getting carried away with attachment to food. But there's somebody else who, they'll eat whatever's given to them, and the moment they're finished with their meal, they're going to forget about it and then move on with their day. They what? They eat to live. They don't live to eat, right? For those kinds of people, food is a much more minor factor in their spiritual life. So remember, no one-size-fits-all for those kinds of things. You have to figure out what are my true needs, and then what are just wants, which are hindrances in my spiritual life. And there's a great danger of self-deception in spiritual life when you ask these kinds of questions about yourself. Many people want to believe that what are actually wants are in fact needs. The ego is deeply invested in convincing yourself that, no, I actually need that Lamborghini. I actually need to eat at the 5-star restaurant, because what will other people say if I only eat at a 4-star restaurant or drive around a Honda Accord? But that's not a need. So these are actually wants disguised as needs. And so you have to, one thing I like about Eckhart Tolle, his work, especially A New Earth, I recommend that book to everybody. Apparently he came to our bookstore here in Santa Barbara and he did a book signing. So hopefully he comes again. A New Earth, I recommend it. There's about 150 pages. A whole section of the book is devoted to what he calls the many faces of the ego. And it's a kind of dissection of the different ways that the ego can play tricks on you. And I'm tempted at some point to give a lecture called Self-Deception in Spiritual Life, because there's so many different ways in which we can deceive ourselves and then short-circuit our spiritual progress without knowing it. One of the main ways I'm finding, I was in India for 13 years, and I came back to the US last August. Everybody and their mother seems to have already had spiritual experiences, and they love talking about them. They raise their hand and say, I have a question. I've realized God. Or, it's not a question, it's an announcement. And I'm not saying that nobody has had spiritual experiences, but it's good to, first of all, if you've really had a spiritual experience, your first impulse shouldn't be to shout it to the skies and to tell everybody that you've met. And if that is your first impulse, I think there's good reason to doubt whether that was a genuine experience. As Christ said, don't throw pearls before swine. And if something is really precious to you, why would you share it with God? But you don't need to share it with other people. Anyway, that's a kind of a detour. But so that answered one part of your question. Then what was the other part of it?
So like if I create a distance from my thoughts, how do I get the motivation?
Oh, it's a very good question. I get this question a lot, specifically in the context of karma yoga. Because Gita, we didn't talk about this today really, but Gita is all about, one of the keynotes of the Gita is to engage in karma yoga, nishkama karma, which means you do whatever is your duty, but nishkama, without desiring the fruits of that work. And then your question is, well, if we don't desire the fruits of our work, how are we going to muster the motivation to do the work in the first place? So I like to use an example. Imagine you're a doctor, and you have to do a critical surgery on a patient. Okay, desiring the fruits of that action in this case would be desiring that the surgery be a success and that you can save the patient, right? Now, what the Gita tells you is, do your duty to the best of your ability, but leave the results to God. Because that's not in our hands. Any surgeon will tell you that. You can be the best surgeon in the world, and your patient might die. And if you are deeply attached to the fruits in that sense, success or failure, you're going to be distraught, devastated if the patient dies, for instance. But if you are a karma yogi when you do the surgery, you'll be as skillful. Yoga ha karmasu kaushalam. That means skillfulness. There's a definition in chapter 2 of the Gita. Karma yoga is defined as skillfulness in action. It's not that you do it lackadaisically, half-heartedly, No, you do it with full enthusiasm. That's also in chapter 18. It says, Mukta sango na hambadi dhriti utsaha samanvitaha. Siddhya siddhyo nirvikaraha katta sattvika uchyate. The sattvika actor, the agent, person engaging karma yoga. What are the attributes? Mukta sangaha, completely free of all attachments. Some people are deeply attached to a certain kind of work. That's a sign of rajas. They love something, and if they can't do without it. That's another kind of bondage, actually, in spiritual life. Mukta sango. Anahamvadi, without being egoistic about the work. Some people are incredibly puffed up with pride. Look at how great I am at doing this. And they have these giant egos as a result of being the greatest surgeon in the world, the greatest lawyer in the world. Mukta sango anahamvadi dhriti utsaha samanvitaha. This is what I want to emphasize. Dhriti utsaha samanvitaha. Full of what? Dhriti, perseverance. Seeing through the work to the very end. With utsaha, enthusiasm. It's not indifference. We were talking about indifference. It's not indifference. Full enthusiasm, energy. You do the work, but leave the fruits to God. In India, there's a common expression, do your best, leave the rest. Leave the rest to whom? To God. Okay, dhriti utsaha samanvidha. Siddhya siddhyo nirvikaraha. Be unaffected by success and failure. That is the sattvika actor. Now coming back to the surgeon example. Imagine tragically that the patient dies. The surgeon has done his best or her best. Patient dies. The person who is not doing it as karma yoga will be completely devastated and might not even be able to sleep for a month, thinking that it's my fault and I could have done this, I could have done that. But let's just posit that there's no malpractice and that he actually did his best. If you're a karma yogi, you're not going to be indifferent. You're going to be full of sympathy and love for the patient's family, but without being devastated by it. Because that's God's will. That I did my best, I know that, but the patient died by God's will. So that's just one example, but I hope that clarifies it. Thanks. Yeah, in the back. And I think you had a question first. So why don't we give first you and then back? Yeah.
My name is Carol, and it just follows with what you were saying about letting go, being indifferent to those feelings, and how do you guard against that apathy or indifference? Right. And you sort of touched on that.
Yeah, let me add one more dimension to this. Bring in bhakti yoga, because in Bhagavad Gita, karma yoga and bhakti yoga are kind of inseparably united. Karma yoga is most often explained by Krishna as doing whatever work is allotted to you and giving the fruits to God. Chapter 3, Mai sarvani karmani sanyasyadhyatma chetasa nirashi nirmamo bhutva yudhyasva vigata jvaraha. Whatever actions you engage in, give them to me. Do them for me, is what Krishna is saying. And focus on your true nature, adhyatma chetasa, your true spiritual nature. As what? Now the devotional understanding of the true self is that you're a servant of God, you're a child of God. And this has precedent in the Upanishads. One of the famous statements in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad is Amritasya Putra. This is one of Swami Vivekananda's favorite statements in the Upanishads. Each one of us is a child of immortal bliss. We are all children of immortal bliss. So if you think in those terms, and let's say you're a householder, you've got a spouse, you've got children, you've got a 9-to-5 job. Whatever you're doing, whether you're raising your kids or going to work, do it as a servant of God and do it for God. Think of yourself as a servant of God doing this work because God wants you to do this work. This is the work that God has appointed to you. Do it to the best of your ability, and then that becomes a motivation. The motivation is to please God and to serve God. So it's not that you don't have a motivation, but the motivation changes. It's not egoistic anymore. It's not, I'm doing this to make money. I'm going to work to make money so that I can get that beautiful car I want, or, no, I'm doing it to please God. And whether I get name and fame, or it's not that you have to all be beggars and not get money. No. Whether money comes, how much money I get, up to God. Whether my work success is the crucial attitude. Does that make sense? Thank you. Back there, and then here. Yeah, first. Yeah.
Yeah, we quite two questions.
Mm-hmm.
One on karma yoga and the fruits of your labors. I ran a business and read the Gita and thought this is exactly the right thing to do. And what happened was when you run something to those principles, you do really well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you really put it into practice.
So our business, this is a big one, went, it grew huge.
Wow.
So the question is, what do you do with the fruits?
Offer them to God.
But
And-
I'm just, so my question, I guess, there is we created, because we had an intensity towards this, towards doing the right thing.
Right.
And we inculcated that in the culture.
Sure.
And we just, and then when you do that, things just take off.
No, that's wonderful. And you ask what to do with it. Use them for noble purposes.
Yeah.
And not just, in the way that like super billionaires like make a show of donating to charity, but like really do it in the spirit of giving or not giving, but of serving those in need,
Because I
those in
didn't find
distress.
that in the Gita. They said, do the best you can, and then the fruits will either come or they won't. But what happens what I think is really interesting about it with karma yoga is if you focus on karma yoga, you do everything well, in
You will
our
get the
society,
fruits. Yeah.
The fruits will be huge.
That's true. And then what do you do with the fruit? That's interesting. So we need a follow-up to the Gita. So
Yeah.
what do we do with the fruits? And I think that the Vedantic answer is you use the fruits in the noblest possible way for your own spiritual progress, but also to help others in distress, in need. I think that would be the best thing.
And the other question I had is the ganas. When you read the Gita, it's very hard to figure out how they play or interplay. Could you give a one-on-one answer to what they are and how one should think about them?
Well, I'm afraid I have to plug another one of my lectures then. So
Okay, good.
on YouTube, if you type in my name and then type in 3 gunas, I gave a lecture recently, last month in Houston, called The 3 Gunas in Spiritual Life, A Practical Guide. And I go into great detail. And it would take me an hour at least to explain the workings of the 3 gunas, and because there's so many different aspects to it. And I go into detail in both Bhagavad Gita and its explanation of the gunas, but also the gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, and link them together. And so that would take us way too far afield. But please feel free to go to YouTube and just type in Medhananda 3 gunas and you'll find that lecture.
Okay, I'm going to hopefully get your name, because that's the only part of the Gita I find, and other people who I've given it to, they get confused on that.
Okay, no, that's why I gave that lecture, because I know, and there's a lot of material in the Gita. The gunas come up in many verses, in not just chapter 14, but in chapter 18 and chapter 17, and putting it all together in a framework is actually pretty tricky, and it takes work. But it's extremely helpful and practical in spiritual life, and that's what I emphasize in that lecture. So please do look it up on YouTube, and if you have any further questions, you can catch me next time I come to Santa Barbara. All right. And sure. And I think you had a question?
Is Buddhistic meditation more popular because they don't bring God in the picture?
That might be one of the reasons. And the beauty of Vedantic mindfulness is you don't need to bring in God either if you don't feel like it. But it's an option. It's not mandatory, but it's an option for those who are also devotional in nature. Both and, right? Why treat them as mutually exclusive? If it's helpful to your practice, practice devotion to your heart's content. But with Buddhism, usually it's a no-no. Right?
Swami, could you please give tips on coherently combining the paths of jnana and bhakti, more so on the jnana framework, adding bhakti in?
Okay, but in the context of mindfulness or just in general? What's the question? Can you ask the... Because
It doesn't say.
well, okay. With regard to mindfulness, which was the subject of our talk, it's very easy. Engage in mindfulness, which is the way I explained it in the Gita, but take the help of God. When you feel like you're not able to do the practice as well as you could be, you can just immediately start praying. So you can combine mindfulness with prayer, for instance, and pray to God to help you in your mindfulness practice. So that's a concrete example. Now, if you're asking about how to reconcile Jnana Yoga and Bhakti Yoga more generally, kind of outside the context of mindfulness, then I would say it's complicated, and it depends on how you understand Jnana Yoga and how you understand Bhakti Yoga. But I'll just give you one simple example. In Ramanuja's tradition, which is qualified non-dualism, Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, he fully embraces Jnana Yoga. Many of us don't even know that. We only study, those of us who know anything about Vedanta usually only study Shankara's school. But if you study Ramanuja's school, and I'll plug a book here, which I found very helpful, Bhakti Schools of Vedanta by Swami Tapasyananda, who is a vice president of our order. He explains in great detail the Bhakti schools, including Ramanuja's school. So according to Ramanuja, I mentioned it briefly in the talk, but I'll just say it again. Okay, Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge, is the practice of meditating on your true, eternal, spiritual nature separate from the body-mind complex. This sounds like Shankara, but this is Ramanuja. Okay? Meditate on your true nature as an eternal individual self, separate from the body-mind complex. Ultimately, this practice of Jnana Yoga, combined with Karma Yoga, should culminate in the realization of your eternal spiritual nature. That's called Atma Avalokanam, according to Ramanuja. That realization then makes you eligible to practice Bhakti Yoga, which is the higher practice, because you cannot feel true devotion for God until you have actually realized your eternal spiritual nature separate from the body-mind complex. So you see how these two things, Jnana Yoga and Bhakti Yoga, in Ramanuja's philosophy, are intimately united. And in fact, he's turning the tables on Shankara, because Shankara says Bhakti Yoga is a preparatory discipline to then practice Jnana Yoga. Ramanuja says, other way around. Practice Jnana Yoga to become eligible to practice true Bhakti Yoga. You cannot feel true love and devotion for God so long as you mistakenly identify with the body-mind complex. So that's one example. I can go on, but I'll stop there. And one last question. Yeah, just repeat it, and then I can...
Actually, for the Gospel of Thakur, it is in Bengali.
Correct.
So, I want the best translation which can be given to my friends or anybody who wants that in English.
Okay.
Which one the best one?
Okay. So it's nothing to do with the talk, but I'm going to answer the question because some other people may have the same question. So my answer is, there are several translations of the Gospel of the original Bengali Sri Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita. I think the best existing translation is Swami Nikhilanandaji's translation, and it's very widely available in all of our centers, bookstores. You can probably get it here. And I teach a gospel class in Hollywood, and I sometimes respectfully disagree with some of Nikhilanandaji's renderings, translations of particular words. Sometimes he omits things. So I'm not saying it's perfect. No translation is perfect. But it is astonishingly good. And part of the reason is because his English is not just flawless, but it's sterling. I mean, stylistically, it's incredibly beautiful and elegant and moving without being florid. And it's very difficult to pull that off in a translation because I've read other translations which are awful. And at the same time, because he is a native Bengali speaker, he grew up in Bengal, he has a very, very deep and intimate understanding of the Bengali language. Where I differ from him are things like he omits things, and there are good reasons for it. He translated for a Western audience, an American audience in the 1930s, I think. And so he tends to translate God as he, capital H-E. And I always say, no, with Sri Ramakrishna, it's usually she, S-H-E, Divine Mother. So and then he omits chapter headings and section headings because he felt that, well, it's not necessary for the Western audience. So I personally think that Nikhilanandaji's is by far the best existing translation of the original Bengali Kathamrita, but that it can be revised in minor ways to make it even better. That's my opinion. Thank you.
And one more thing.
Yeah.
And almost the original Gita version in English.
What is the best translation of the Bhagavad Gita in English? That's an even harder question because there are like a million.
I know, but
so, yeah.
I know Gorakhpur made some. Gorakhpur.
Well, everybody has a translation of the Gita. I mean, there are hundreds of translations.
From
but
our school.
From our school, that's interesting. You mean the Ramakrishna Vivekananda? That's an even more difficult and interesting question because I'm about to teach a new class in Hollywood called the Bhagavad Gita in the Light of Sri Ramakrishna, and I'm debating which text to use. It's difficult because we don't have a commentary on the Gita, a full commentary from the standpoint of our tradition. The thing is, so my answer is complicated. Here's how I put it. There is one text which I would recommend by Swami Tapasyanandaji called the Bhagavad Gita, the Scripture of Mankind, something like that. Now, the advantage of that is that he was a follower of our tradition, deeply scholarly. Competent translation. Of course, with translations, I always say, especially translations of poetry, because the Gita is originally Sanskrit poetry, you have to sacrifice either accuracy for the sake of spiritual power in poetry, or you sacrifice spiritual power and beauty for the sake of accuracy. And Tapasanji leans on the side of the latter, which means it's a little bit, translation-wise, it's a little dry. It's not going to come off as very poetic. Yeah, but you can't. It's not. There's always going to be a trade-off in translations. Okay, so translation-wise, Tapasanji, it's accurate though. What you lose in poetic beauty, you gain in accuracy. Okay, but more importantly, from the standpoint of our tradition, he has footnotes to important verses where he gives really original readings sometimes, discussions of kind of comparing Shankara's interpretation of this verse with Ramanujan. Then he says, if we bring in Sri Ramakrishna's idea of vijnana here, this and that, we have an even better understanding of this verse.
Can I actually ask you,
Yeah.
why do you prefer that to the Chidbhavananda one, which a lot of people...
Yeah. Why don't you give her the mic so that
Why do you prefer that to the Chidbhavananda translation, which is popular in Southern California right now?
Yeah, I mean, I don't dislike the Chidbhavananda translation, and that's another book that it's a kind of resource, which I might even use. But to answer that question, let me introduce another book, and then I'll explain it in that context. I think the best commentary on the Bhagavad Gita from the standpoint of the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition is, drumroll, Sri Aurobindo's Essays on the Gita. Now the thing is, the difficulty with that is, he doesn't mention Sri Ramakrishna anywhere in the 600-page commentary. And so we're in this funny situation where, okay, now coming back to Chidbhavananda, this book, who was a monk of our order. I think he left at some point, I believe. Okay, yeah. So in any case, he refers explicitly to some of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings in the course of his commentary. Sometimes those are apt references, other times not quite so apt. And secondly, it's just not as deep a commentary. It's not as deep an interpretation. Sri Aurobindo was a realized soul and had mystical communications with both Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. In his Alipur jail, when he was in jail for a year, Swami Vivekananda came to him every night for a fortnight and taught him meditation. He had ecstatic spiritual realizations. He communicated with Sri Ramakrishna 3 times on a mystical plane and understood their life and teachings very deeply at a spiritual level. And on that basis, he wrote this commentary on the Gita, which was divinely inspired, I think, in my opinion. You might think this is over the top, but that's just my opinion. And so when you read Sri Aurobindo, but it's very difficult because his English is tough. English is tough, and if your mother tongue is not English, it's even tougher. But if you can handle the English, I think it's by far the best and deepest and most profound commentary on the Bhagavad Gita from the standpoint of the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition. But you have to do quite a bit of work to see Sri Ramakrishna and Vivekananda and what he's saying, because he doesn't refer to them explicitly. So that's what I've tried to do already, and I have an article, if you're interested, it's with a very pompously academic title, Toward a New Hermeneutics of the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Ramakrishna, Sri Aurobindo, and the Secret of Vijnana. And I plan to write an entire book on Sri Aurobindo, where there would be one chapter on the Bhagavad Gita. So, with Sri Aurobindo's Essay on the Gita, I would say is the best commentary we have from the standpoint of our tradition, but it requires work on our end to find the Ramakrishna and Vivekananda elements in what Sri Aurobindo's saying. Chidbhavananda has the virtue of directly referring to our tradition, but I think it's not nearly as deep or profound as Sri Aurobindo's commentary. But it has the advantage, as I said, that there are explicit references to the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. And Swami Tapasanji has not written a full commentary. I wish he had, because he's one of the few people in our order who could have pulled it off. But he didn't, and that's a shame. I might, if God willing, write commentaries on the Prasthanatraya. That's one idea I have in mind. Some of the main Upanishads, a separate book on Bhagavad Gita, and a third on the Brahma Sutra. But everything's up to God. So we don't have that yet. But as I said, so it's a kind of triangulation between Chidbhavananda, Sri Aurobindo's Essay on the Gita, and Swami Tapasanji's Bhagavad Gita would be a very complicated answer to your question. Okay, all right. Well, no, I like the question. I think it's an important question to ask. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.